Well,
University?
students are starting to come in, as you can see. They try to be punctual. 1 o'clock. They're trying to be punctual. Hi, Grant. How are you?
Hi, Carl.
We have
Hello?
Carl. He will introduce himself in a minute because you guys are both from the same country, I think.
That could
Grant
be.
Distance away.
Grant is from the United States, but he's our student here in Mexico. Yeah. I actually don't know, where are you from, Grant? Like in the States, from which state?
That's a good question. I haven't been back in so long. Sometimes I forget myself.
That sounds
Yeah,
like
this is-
me.
Yeah, that sounds like Carl, right? Yeah, I'm from Oregon. How about you, Carl?
Oh, okay. I was born in on Long Island, in New York, but
I
I
can hear
have
a little
not
bit of Long Island.
I have not lived there. Yeah, I once met a guy and he was like, "Oh, you must be from that part of Long Island." I was like,
Really? I can tell
"Yeah."
this part of the
But I haven't lived there probably longer than many of you have been alive. I think I left Long Island at the end of high school to go to university, and that was, really the last time I was there more than to visit. So that was
You never
like
look back.
30 years ago or something like that. So I know almost nobody I know that I grew up with still lives there either. So lots of other places since then.
So Long Island is a place that people are born, but people don't tend to stick around.
Yeah, pretty much. It's like the opposite of California. Everybody goes to California, everybody
Everyone goes
leaves
to,
Long
yeah.
Island.
But Long Island is more of like I think of it as a place people go to retire and stuff, right?
My
I,
parents retired away from Long Island. Even they left Long Island.
I thought the Hamptons were a big retiree spot. Is that true?
Oh, yeah, I think you have to be richer than my parents to retire to the Hamptons.
Yeah, you have to be very rich. Okay, guys, well, let's begin. We already have 9 people logging in. Thank you very much, everybody, for being so punctual. Let me now formally introduce my dear friend, Professor Carl Anderson. He will tell you a little bit about himself because his credentials are like, oh my God. I can tell you about him, but it's better if he tells you about him. He has a PhD, and we always make fun of this because he knows I am doing my PhD right now, and we always
You
laugh
have my
about-
sympathy.
we always make fun of this PhD research thing and etc. So it's usually something he has already been through that. So I hope he can tell you about that. And the reason why we invited our friend Carl to finish up with our last class. Today is our last class of the whole semester. We're finishing our semester today. Today is the last class of our global business semester. I'm very happy to have him. As I said in Spanish, we're closing. Vamos a cerrar con broche de oro. Okay. He's a wonderful guest. He has been living in Colombia, as he said, for a long time. And I think what he has to share with us about this moving to a different country, getting used to work with people who think so differently than you, to different cultures, different, likes, dislikes, customs, traditions, etc. I think, honestly, he's going to be the perfect guest to close our semester for global business. So thank you very much. Help me give Carl a virtual yay, welcome to our global business class. And we're very happy to have you, Carl. And now,
thank you.
The microphone is all yours. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I'll try to keep this introduction as short as possible, although I know that this is the interculturality thing. So that does take some time to get through. I'm not sure in the end that you won't find people who've lived in a lot more places than I have, but I can at least say that I've lived in a few places and I've done different things in those places, and I've played a few different roles in those places. So as I was just saying with your classmate Grant, I was born in the United States, and certainly most of my family is from the United States. I was born in Long Island, which is outside of New York City. And I grew up there mostly, but when I was about 12 or 13, my dad, who's a research scientist, he had a sabbatical year in England, and this was like way back in the early 80s, really, and the world was less connected then, you know, no internet, expensive international phone calls, all that kind of thing. So even though it was an English-speaking country, it seemed very exotic. And I remember sitting and reading like guidebooks that said like, oh my, you know, I was, you know, oh my God, did they really eat that in England? And, you know, things like that. Um, and when I got there, it was definitely a bit of a culture shock. I arrived immediately after the school year had started. All the kids in England went, you know, I went to a state school in England, but they all had uniforms in the United States. You don't have uniforms in state public schools. So I showed up with the wrong clothes, with the wrong accent. I didn't know anybody. You know, it was like absolutely you know, a teenager's nightmare. But you know, you're also still adaptable at that age, and you still have some ability to, you know, learn new things and fit in. So I spent some time fitting in there, and by the end of the year, I think people thought that some of my teachers even thought that maybe I was an English kid who had spent a while in the States instead of an American kid who had spent a while in England. And it was all very strange. People got there and it was like an exotic thing, like, oh, you're an American. Do you wear a cowboy hat? Do you drive in a limousine? Do you have a six-shooter? All these kinds of things, because that was people's way of learning about other countries really at the time. You saw it on television, you saw it in the movies. And maybe that's to some extent still true, but we at least have a much bigger palette to draw from. So maybe that's less the case, but it was all very like dropping into another planet at the time, even though it was another English speaking country. But it was a good experience. And it was, you know, after I got over the initial.
Okay, we lost you, Carl. We cannot hear you. Something happened. It's okay. Maybe it's the connection. We have to be very patient because also Carl, let me tell you, he just moved to a different house last week and he was just about to cancel actually his participation. And I'm just very grateful that he decided to join us because, oh, here.
Oh,
there
sorry, I
go.
think I
We
must
lost
have
you
lost.
for a second, Carl.
My screen froze and I wasn't sure if.
Yes.
I wasn't sure.
No. We got you back. Okay, continue, please. Thank you.
Where was I? I was somewhere in England, so that was good. So I spent a year there, and I went back to the States. And then going back to the States, if some of you have lived for any amount of time in another country, you know that you never really quite go home again. So it was now strange going back to the place where it was the same town that I'd grown up in and the same kids that I'd gone to school in just a year later. But that was also a bit of an adjustment and getting used to it again. And then they say there is research that says, like, you know, children of immigrants and things like that, well, they tend to also be immigrants. And I wasn't a child of immigrants, but I was at least the great-grandchild of immigrants, you know, unless you are actually of indigenous ancestry, everybody in the States is from somewhere else. And so you're very aware of that, at least in my family growing up. Oh, everybody came from somewhere else and great-grandmother came from here and, you know, had to learn to speak English and things like that. And so having lived outside myself, you know, as a kid with my parents in another house, I think that sort of inspired me to kind of keep moving. And so after I went to university, in the States. I went away. You do that in the States. You go away and you go to another town quite often and you live somewhere else. And so I moved from a small suburban, you know, town that looks like something out of a sitcom in the suburbs to a big city, Boston, the Boston area, and went to school there. And that was a new thing. And, you know, I studied there and I worked there. And then for graduate school, I decided to go back to England because I could, because it was a possibility, because I said, oh, this would be a good idea. But I think to some extent I was still moving. You want to go and you want to do more things. And certainly when you're in your 20s, like I presume many of you are, it seems more attractive and you're not as tired. But anyway, I went off to graduate school in England, and that was still in the 90s, the mid 90s. And the internet was just starting to become a thing, and you could just about start to communicate with more people and do more things more easily. I went off to graduate school in England, got my doctorate there, as Ada was saying. that's all an experience. Very different doing graduate school in England than it is in the States, and probably than it is in Mexico or in Colombia. And then I thought at the end of that, well, that's it. I'm done now. I'm going to go back to the States and do whatever I do next. I don't know what that is, but I'll go back. So I did go back to the States, and I was back in the Boston area, and I was there for less than a year before I was looking for a job. And I wasn't even looking for an academic job, because academic jobs in my field paid so incredibly badly, and there were no, we don't need to go down that road. But I was looking for any job, and the first job that I was interviewing and doing things, and the first job I got was back in England. And it was actually back in Cambridge, where I'd done my graduate school. And I just shipped all of my stuff from graduate school back to the States, and now suddenly I was going back to, I was like, well, there you go. So I was back in England, and this time not in school, which is a little bit, as I'm sure you know, a bit of a strange bubble. School is not quite living at home, at least not for me. It wasn't, because I wasn't at home, but it's not quite the real world of working and doing things and looking after yourself all the time. But now it was. Now I was in England living there, and I had to, you know, take care of all my things myself, and was working there. So that was a different thing, and I stayed in England for another 7 or 8 years, I guess, working. But my wife, who I met in England, was Colombian, and she was a lawyer, and lawyers and doctors do not travel well. You're not qualified to be in anywhere else. You know, if you're a doctor in Mexico, you're a doctor in Mexico, but not anywhere else. If you're a lawyer in Mexico, you're a lawyer in Mexico, but not really anywhere else. And so it was easier for me to travel. So I ended up going to Colombia, which was, at least in England, I had the benefit of a similar language. Although anybody who has traveled between the States and England can tell you they're not quite the same. Sort of like if you go from Mexico to Spain, not quite the same, or Mexico to Argentina, not quite the same. But at least it was still English. And I have never studied Spanish, and I had never been to any other Latin American country, not even Mexico, not even Florida. So suddenly I was also now, you know, not just getting used to a different culture and a different way of doing things, which England certainly is compared to the States. And people forget this, but different places in Britain, you know, don't confuse the Scots with the English, and don't confuse the Northern English with the Southern English, and they'll murder you. But now I was suddenly dealing with the new language and quite the different culture and that sort of thing. And so I went to Colombia, and for a couple of years I worked as a contractor still with my company in England, but then the financial crisis came in 2007, 2008. That disappeared, and there was no more tech jobs really in Colombia. I've been working in a tech company in England, but I still had a PhD. And there are universities here in Colombia. So luckily, through some contacts, I ended up at a university here in Colombia, where I started about 10 years ago. And I was in the Department of Foreign Languages and Cultures, which at least made some kind of sense. But just a few months ago, they reorganized units in my university, and now I'm somehow in the Faculty of Education. And so here I am, educating. Despite not really having any qualifications to do that, except for the 10 years I spent working on language teaching and intercultural studies and that sort of thing. And just recently, my mother from the States came to live with me here. I'm literally in a new house. You can't see the mess that's off camera to the one side. So I've just moved again, and I'm now busy trying to help my mom, who's like 77 years old and has like about 10 or 20 words of Spanish, which she studied when she was in university. And we're all getting used to that sort of thing. But luckily, it's a very multicultural house. My daughter is technically Colombian, but I think she uses English more than Spanish. She spends too much time paying attention to me. You know, there's a Colombian maid who speaks Spanish all the time, doesn't have any English. My mother, who speaks English most of the time, barely has any Spanish. Myself and my daughter somewhere in between. So it's a little tiny multicultural house. And that's essentially my multicultural story of being a kid, moving to different countries with maybe a similar kind of language, studying also in England, working in England. I haven't lived elsewhere in Europe, I guess, but and now for quite a while living in Colombia, with a language and culture that I had never expected to get used to, but nevertheless, here I am. Y ya puedo defenderme en español, más o menos. I did not start learning Spanish until I was like 30, so I don't think I will ever have a good accent. I can imitate a British English accent pretty well because I did that when I was 12. But when I speak Spanish, my daughter will be like, Dad, stop that. It's weird. But could be worse. I can get by. And that's my introduction journey. A bit of working, a bit of studying, a bit of moving around, sometimes more or less by accident. But and now, unlike when I was like, 12 or when I was 20, I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to stop moving around. No more. But you never know. You never know. If you'd asked me 20 years ago, are you going to be living in Colombia in South America, I would say, what? I'm not even sure where that is. So who knows? Could be somewhere else in Latin America. You never know in this day and age. And that's what I think is going to be very exciting for all of you, that you can move around, and maybe not during the pandemic, but otherwise you can move around more easily. And if you've got those skills and you've got the language skills and the intercultural skills, which are in some ways more important than the language skills, I can sit down and start learning Spanish, or I could sit down and start learning Chinese, but using it in the context and knowing how to do things is another thing. Just in the last month, I went back to the States to help my mom. My dad recently died of cancer, not of COVID, but I had to help her sort things out. And I hadn't been in the States for like 25 years, and I didn't know how things worked. I was like, how do I do this? How do I do that? How do I do the other thing? Where am I allowed to turn right here without the red light? And whatever it was. I've been out of touch for a while, and the States is not the same place it was 25 years ago. So I almost had to relearn that again. Nevertheless, that's the kind of world. You go, you come back, you leave, you go there, you go there. Maybe your parents, my parents, my grandparents, if my great-grandparents moved to another continent, which some of them did, that was it. They were there. They had to learn the new way, but they didn't, expect to move continents again. And they weren't going to go back and visit their relatives, or they weren't going to go visit somebody in another continent. They certainly weren't going to call anybody up. But that's what I think is exciting for you, or my daughter, who's like 11, that there are those opportunities. And the language skills are important. But even me at 30 could start learning Spanish. But having not just the intercultural skills like, oh, this is how it works in England, or this is how it works in New York, or this is how it works in Colombia, but the strategies to figure that out and to not mess anything up too badly before you figure it out, and to know, where can I get help? Where can I get information? Who knows how to do this already? Who can explain it to me? How can I get through the next 24 hours without, completely ruining my life? Those are skills that hopefully you've got to get a bit of introduction to. As Ada was saying, your course here is called Global Business, but a lot of it is about those intercultural skills, which are going to be important for business, which are going to be important for daily life, and you're not going to get business done without daily life happening. So those skills, if you're going to learn one thing, learn to make your way in an unfamiliar place and survive long enough that you can learn the next thing you need to learn. But hopefully you've got a good start in doing that. And I would certainly be happy to try to answer anybody's questions or interrogations or anything like that you may have. Here I am.
Thank you so much, Carl. Actually, your introductory speech, it's almost like you're talking to me, because even though we're friends, I don't think I have told you I'm moving to Vancouver.
You did tell me. I was
I did tell you.
I was like,
so
really? You're moving to Vancouver?
All these words that you're just giving my students and all these suggestions, like just try to survive for the next 24 hours and then trying to see how you're going to probably work out for the next, I don't know, ask or whatever. Well, I thought you were just talking to me. Anyway.
Well, I'm talking to me. I'm talking to me because I go through this all the time.
I'll be going through that very soon. Oh my God.
You know, because like the other day I was, you know, we moved and I think I mentioned this on Facebook, one of my lovely microphones that I have broke. And I was like, wow, how do I go and get a microphone fixed in Bogota? Who do I talk to? How do I, you know, so it's an ongoing process. And sure, I would have to do the same thing if I had lived in New York all my life, or I was still living in England. But there are those psychological barriers there where you're like, oh, I haven't done this before, not in this place, not in this language. Who do I talk to? Who's the right person to talk to? And even if you're sitting there like, okay, I have to call someone on the phone or I have to send them a message on Facebook, you know, what's the right form? Is it too formal? Is it insufficiently formal? Should I try to use that slang word that I learned the other day, or would that be a really bad idea? You know, so it's an ongoing process. And I think it would be true for some of you too, if you, I don't know where you're all from in Mexico, maybe you're from different places and you've come to the university from somewhere else, but Mexico is also a really big place, like the States is a really big place. And I'm sure the different regions are very different. And I certainly find that sometimes in Colombia, students who've come, you know, I'm close to the capital, so I know how that is, but I know it's different in other places. And kids who come to the university from elsewhere, they're like, these people here are weird. They don't do like, you know, I'm going to go, I feel more comfortable, you know, so I'm sure if you've done that within Mexico, that's also something that you go through. Oh, how do things work in, you know, this new place that I am compared to where I was? So I think that's, you know, that's a good place to start with that interculturality, is start at home. You know, one town is not like another. One family is not like another. You know, you have to, you know, your best friend growing up, maybe their family did something a different way, you know, and if you start thinking about that, and you start trying to think, oh, how do I fit in? You know, they eat dinner like this, and in my house, we eat dinner like this. And that just gets you down that path of thinking about that. Oh, how do I fit in? And you don't want to just lose yourself. You don't want to say like, oh, now I am something that I'm not. But how do I keep being me, but I be myself in different places? And I get done the things that I need to do, and I be the person I need to be, and you know, I get through daily life and I get through business or my job or whatever it is. But having that practice, I mean, it probably helped that I started when I was a little kid. And it's probably helped that I started easy in a country where things were done very differently, but the language was at least not so much of a barrier. Sometimes I would have to ask the English kids, could you say that again? I don't know that word. I didn't understand that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you get through that. But having that practice, having that, oh, I can go to different places and now I've learned how to figure it out. That kind of building up that kind of confidence from a young age is, I think, very useful. And you're all still young, so.
Yes, I'm so glad our students are young. Actually, I would like now our students to ask you questions because I think, as I already mentioned at the beginning, most of them maybe have traveled for vacation, etc. But we have wonderful students here, and I really hope you can, students, have some questions for Carl. Okay, so anyone, please? Yes, Grant, go ahead.
I have a two-part question. The first part's a little more general, and the second part's a little more personal. First, what do you think are the biggest mistakes that people, specifically Americans, make traveling or living in another place? Because I think I get frustrated by I get frustrated by getting. And
yeah.
So what do you think are some of the things that could improve?
I think it's true for everyone, not just Americans, but, you know, Americans, because historically there have been a lot of Americans and they've had the money to travel. They make the more mistakes, but they're the same mistakes that everyone makes. And I think it is just that realization that things are different somewhere else, and you can't just act the same way or speak the same way. You need to spend a little time observing and seeing how other things work. And I think that's true everywhere. I mean, I see You know, if I see Colombians traveling, they make the same mistakes that the Americans traveling do. It's just less obvious because there are fewer of them. But I remember being in England, and you know, I was good at fitting in to some extent, and I made a conscious effort to fit in, and I knew that I would always be. I wasn't English, but I could fit in and work in the pattern, and people would then think I was Canadian or something like that. And I figured, well, that was a sign that I must, they didn't think, oh, that Yank. I was able to get by and become sort of invisible in a way. I was no longer, the most noticeable thing about me was not that I was from somewhere else. It was some other annoying habit that I had probably. But, being able to, I mean, that goes back to what I was saying, being able to be me, but without being ostentatiously in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I think that's something that comes from practice. Comes from doing it and thinking about it. I'm sure that if you are from another part of Mexico, or you're from another part of the States and you have moved when you were young, you get used to saying, oh, I'm now in a different place and things work in a different way. And you already start to have that chip. But a lot of people don't. A lot of people grow up in one place and it's the same place their parents grew up and they grew up there, and then they go somewhere else and it's just not occurred to them that it's different. And so they'll be acting perfectly normally, for where they are, but maybe it's not quite appropriate, for where they have gotten to. Like most of us would think, oh yeah, I don't speak to my friends in the bar the same way that I speak to my grandma, that I speak to my boss, that I speak to my professor. We change the way that we act for the situation, but that just becomes bigger when we go outside of our normal environment. And so I think that's the mistake that people make. They act like they've always acted, and maybe they're now talking to their boss as if it was their friends in the bar, and maybe their boss is upset by that, or maybe not, it depends on your boss. But if you're not aware that that change is there, that will throw you off. And that's the problem. That's why there's the legend of the ugly American. People who've just come out of some town in the Midwest somewhere, and now they're in Japan and they just don't know what to do. And it hasn't occurred to them that they don't know what to do. And they're thinking it's okay because they're doing what they've already done. And everybody's looking there going, ah. I noticed this also just with language. Like when I lived in England, I worked at a technology company, and a lot of the people were very international. They worked in Europe, they had lived in Europe, they'd come from Europe to England, I'd come there, so, and people would modulate their speech. And maybe in Mexico, you noticed this too. Like if you speak a very, particular dialect from some part of the country and you go somewhere else, well, maybe people don't understand it as well. But there's probably, people who have moved around, they will moderate, they will use less slang, they will speak more clearly, and they will do this almost without thinking about it. Because they're like, oh, here's somebody from somewhere else, and I'm from somewhere else, and I need to shift. And I need to make myself like more in the middle, and we need to find that place to meet. But equally, when I was in England, when, people who hadn't moved around as much and hadn't traveled, well, they would speak in the same accent and dialect that they spoke in all the time. And if you were from somewhere else, that was hard to understand. So there was definitely, it was sort of unconscious, I think, for most people. But if people did have that experience of dealing with people from other places, other dialects of English, other languages, using English as a second language, as, many of you are, they would shift. And they would say, okay, now it's time for me to be more intercultural. And I'm going to come into the middle and meet everyone there. But if you don't have that experience, well, why would you change? You're in your town, you're in the place that you've always been. Somebody else has come from the outside and you're just speaking to them like normal, because you speak to them exactly the way that you speak to your friends and neighbors and et cetera. But suddenly that's harder for them because they haven't got that experience. They haven't got the local cues and the local words and the local understandings, and they don't know how you do things. So there's just that little bit of a barrier. So it is a question of experience, I think. That's why people make those mistakes when they're traveling. They don't realize that they're somewhere else. It seems obvious, but unless you actually are thinking of it. And I would see Americans who would go to England, because it was the university. I don't know of any other foreigners here outside of my household, but I know Colombians. But you would see Americans who were really uncomfortable in England, and they were uncomfortable because it was different. And the English did things a different way than whatever that was they did in America. And it was, it was that kind of oh, if I change, if I do something a different way, then I'll start to lose myself. And I don't want to do it that way. I want to do it my way. And that's why I was saying, you have to have that ability to kind of still be yourself, but also shift, change your clothes. If it's cold, put on a sweater. If it's hot, take off your sweater, but you still remain yourself. And that's not what we teach in schools, right? Except maybe in Ada's class. We're taught that there's an answer and it's in the back of the book and there's one answer and the teacher will tell you if it's right or wrong. And we're not used to figuring that stuff out for ourselves. That's a very long answer to your very simple first question, but hopefully.
Yep. The other thing I was wondering about, this is like more personal, is like, what would have been like the biggest challenge of being married to a Latina? Because I need to take some notes.
I think it's the biggest challenges are those that you would find in a lot of, say, intercultural relationships, sort of like you find them in intergenerational relationships. There are things that are normal for my daughter because she grew up with them that are not normal for me because I didn't. There are things that are normal for my mom or my aunts and uncles that are normal for them because they grew up with them and not for me. And if that's a trap, if you are in a relationship with somebody else who looks like they're from your generation and from your age, and maybe there are some points of similarity, but they're not all there. And so things that, you would take, I'm sure like, and certainly in Colombia, as well as I'm sure in Mexico, everybody knows El Chavo del Ocho. Yeah. El Chavo del Ocho. Yeah, I mean, so I'm sure like, that was like big and, probably my generation or Ada's generation. But probably everybody still watches it, right? My daughter watches it here in Colombia. So there are all those kind of references and things, say, to a television show, just to take that as an example. Now, if maybe you go to the United States now and you can see that on Univision or something, I don't know, reruns of Chavo del Ocho, it's probably all on YouTube. But suddenly, you haven't got that cultural touchstone, and there are things like that I think that's where people run into difficulties because, even if you're in England, if you're an American in England and, you have an English boyfriend or girlfriend or an English spouse or something like that, or an English whole family of in-laws, there's a different set of backgrounds and expectations and the way that things work, different references, different experiences growing up. And you can't assume that everybody else has the same opinion about the same things or has the same references. It could be something simple. Like I remember reading an article, some lady, American lady who's married to a guy in France. And she would she was really frustrated that she would make jokes about the Brady Bunch or, some American television show from, the 70s. And her French husband and relatives would be like, what? What the heck are you talking about? And it's a small thing, but it creates frustrations and communication barriers between people. And frustration and communication barriers between people are, certainly the death of a, personal relationship and probably the death of a business relationship. So that's where you have to be careful there. I always like to look at, a good example of what you can do is, say, if you read something relatively international like The Economist, they'll have cultural references in there. They'll make references to the Beatles or Star Wars or whatever, but they'll be very careful not to get anything too specific. So you have to know what your cultural references are and what you can get away with. And it helps to learn some of those of the other side of the other person. If you're doing business with somebody in France, if you have a relationship with somebody in France, you need to spend time doing homework and, learn about whatever the French equivalent of El Chavo del Ocho is, or, whatever pop music, your business partners or your romantic partners or whoever your friends grew up with, so that you can speak a little bit of that language and you can understand, I need to spend time knowing, what YouTuber my daughter is watching. Not because I'm like, need to be over her shoulder, but I'm like, well, that's what she talks about. So if I'm going to understand her, I need to, it's generational as well as cultural. The past is a different country. So you need to do some homework. And not many people are always willing to do that homework because they feel like I'm a grown-up now. I don't have to do work. I already went to school. Well, maybe you don't guys don't feel like that because you're still in university. But eventually people will be like, I'm done. I don't have to learn new things. And it's like, no, we always have to learn new things, especially if we're putting ourselves into new situations. If you don't want to learn new things, go back home, lock the door, stay inside, even after the pandemic is over. But
no, it's actually such a wonderful answer that you have shared. Yes, doing homework. And I think even though we have talked about it in class, I don't think it was ever so clear to us that when we're trying to do business or even trying to maybe work in a different country, it's not, we cannot give things for granted. And we have to
absolutely.
actually do that. Grant, I don't know if your questions were answered because we already have another question in the chat. Okay, thank you, Grant. Him, I think he's having problems with the microphone, but I'm going to read his question. It says, what do you prefer? It's actually a very good question. What do you prefer, Carl, living in a country because of economic and job-related issues or because of your personal well-being with a lower economic income? This is a wonderful question.
That is an interesting question, and it's a very hard question to answer because I don't feel like I've ever necessarily made a choice. I feel, and that's true if I was moving around in my original country, the States, or if I moved to a different country or moved here. I mean, I suppose I didn't have to go to graduate school in England. I mean, I had to go where my parents went, but I didn't have to go to graduate school in England. I didn't have to go to Colombia. I don't have to be in Colombia. I could choose to go somewhere else. And it's not just a question of, I'm trying to see if I can see it. The question, there we go. Now I can see the chat. See, I've had to learn how to use all these tools that didn't exist when I was a kid. Yeah, I mean, I certainly didn't go to be a graduate student because of economic situation. Being a graduate student anywhere is a lot of work and you're poor. I think it's always a balance. You know, you do what seems like it's going to work out. I mean, for me anyway, you do what seems like it's going to work out best in your life. I mean, I have sometimes thought, like, people ask me, oh, do you ever think about going back to the States? And I think, well, that would be really difficult. You know, certainly now, like, I mean, what job would I get in the States? How would I, you know, support my daughter? She would be having a good time, but I would be going crazy trying to make sure everything worked. You know, would I have more or less money if I did that? So economic issues are difficult to pin down because, you know, yes, absolutely. As a professor in Colombia, I make way less money than probably anybody I know in the States. Even people who are like poor in the States make more money than I do in Colombia. But on the other hand, I can do okay in Colombia. And if I went to another part of Latin America, I probably could too. You know, in an absolute way, I made more money when I was working in England in like the early 2000s, and the pound was really strong. And I lived in a tiny little cramped apartment, like next to the train station, but I had discretionary money to go to Europe, you know, get on the plane and fly there, or get on the train because it wasn't far away, or I could, you know, order that DVD box set from Amazon in the States and have it sent to England because, like, I had relatively high discretionary amounts of money because the pound was so strong and I worked in the tech industry. So, you know, I lived in a tiny house, but I could buy toys. Now I have a relatively big house in Colombia, but I can't buy toys as easily. So, you know, it's hard to say about those things. I would say that, you know, you have to, there's always that balance. If you're going to live or work somewhere else or study somewhere else, the economic, you know, your cost of living, your style of life, your quality of life, that's going to be very personal and depend on you. You know, what's an advantage or what is not, you know, are you single? Do you not have kids? Do you want to, you know, go and travel and do all those kinds of things? Well, that's one kind of lifestyle. Do you have, you know, kids? Do you have a spouse or a boyfriend or a family? That affects other kinds of things. What are you doing your job for? Why are you making that money? You know, like I say, you know, if I go down to the store, I can buy a lot of rice, much more rice than I was able to buy as a graduate student in England. But I have a bigger place to live. So it depends. I mean, certainly living in Colombia teaches me a lot of patience. If you live in America, it is very, you know, consumer friendly. You can go on Amazon and buy anything and have it sent to your house, you know, in 2 days. And if I want to buy a book for my job, I have to like wait, and it has to come like slowly. Maybe it gets lost in the post, comes to Colombia. Sounds familiar? Yeah. So it's just a different thing. You know, so nowadays people say, oh, do you ever think of going back to the States, going back to England? Because I'm an English citizen. I got English citizenship. So I could. When I go to the airport, I have like, it's just like a pile of passports. You know, people have all kinds of different passports. And they're like, how many people are traveling? And I'm like, just us. Even when I came to Colombia, the cat had a passport. But you know, people ask me that, and I'm like, well, actually, no, I don't think so. I could more easily imagine myself going somewhere else in, say, Latin America. You know, go to Brazil, go to Mexico, you know, either for a short time or a longer time, because I feel like that would be easier in my current life than trying to move all the way back to the States and almost start from scratch, or move back to England and almost start from scratch. But there was a period where I thought differently before I had a kid. I was like, well, here I am in England. At the time, I had the right, I was a European citizen. I could move to the south of France. I could move to Barcelona. I could go to, you know, anywhere else in the EU. I was looking at that. I could do that, you know, but that's not something I would look at now just because, you know, circumstances change. And what I'm looking for in life changes.
Yeah, I think I'm going to add a little bit to this answer, and maybe to your question, Gil. I know you're having problems with the microphone, but I'm going to add based on my own personal circumstances right now. As you all know, a year ago, I was still married. I'm not anymore. And I had a house in one of the nicest neighborhoods here in Morelia. My students know, Tres Marias, and you know this. And even though I was never rich, I had this nice house, and you could say probably like, you know, you have a good life. Now that I'll be moving to Vancouver, the only place I can afford is the size of my office right now. Okay.
I think my office is like about the size of like I had 2 floors in England, but I think this office is about the size of the lower floor.
Well, I think, yeah, and I can totally relate because right now that I'll be moving, not because I'm moving to Vancouver or to Canada, it means that I'm going to have the same quality of life that I have here. Of course, I won't, because I will be a student. And even though I'm getting some kind of a scholarship, I'm still paying for some part of my, you know, my school fee, and I can only work part-time, which means the only thing I can afford is a studio apartment, and that's okay. My point is, you have to have this balance, as Carl is saying. Like, sometimes you have to say, well, maybe my personal well-being, I will have certainly a lower income because I will be studying, and of course I can only work part-time. And just like Carl, here I may have a good salary, but in this salary somewhere else is peanuts, you know, it's not enough. But it's okay. Like you say, I used to have a house last year, and now I will rent actually a student apartment. But that's okay, because the final goal, or as Carl was saying, he's doing this also because his family's there, his daughter is there. I mean, there are so many gains to not even thinking about moving somewhere else. And in this case, my gain is I don't care if the size of my apartment is going to be the size of my office, as long as I reach this goal of going back to school, you know? So I don't know, Gil, if I am also giving you some kind of an answer, or anybody else would like to say anything about this topic, guys? I don't know, or anybody else had any question? Yes.
I think that's also the 21st century life that people, you know, in my parents' generation, maybe also in your parents' generation, would think, oh, now I finished, I went to school and now I'm going to work at the company. I work in the company and I live in this town and I buy the house and then that's it. That's what I do for the rest of my life. And I don't think that's the 21st century, like Ada's saying, oh, well, here I am now. And, but then I'm going to go and I'm going to live in a different place and it's going to be different. I'm going to be in school. It's going to be a different country. I'm going to have different priorities, but you have to just decide like, well, what do I want to do now? And you're allowed to change, and you're not on a one trajectory, so you can say, oh, well, when I first came to Colombia and I was still making an English salary and I made a deal with my English company, pay me what you pay your outsourced guys in India, because they had some people working for them in India. I said, just pay me whatever you pay them, which is a lot less than what you pay me in England. And I came to Colombia and they did that. And it was a crazy amount of money in Colombia that they were paying me. So for a very brief period, I was like super rich. I mean, I put most of it into buying a house, but, and then, that job ended and I went and got a professor's salary. And honestly, because I was no longer buying a house, my lifestyle didn't change a lot. But you have to if you look at that in an absolute terms, you go like, oh my God, last week I was making crazy money and now.
I think we lost Carl again. Okay, and here you are. We lost you for a second.
I think I'm back.
Yeah, we lost you. Now you're back.
But it's like, this is what I'm trying to do. If I was like, well, what I want to do is my PhD, then you go and do it. And you take whatever comes with that. And then later, probably she, can go back to Mexico or go somewhere else in the world or the States or Latin America. And she'll be like, okay, now I'm doing a different thing. And, I'm not a starving graduate student anymore, but now I'm a teacher again. And, nothing is fixed like people thought it was a generation ago. You can go places, you can do things. And sometimes you'd be like, okay, now I'm going to be poor, but I'm doing this thing that I want to do. And now I'm going to be rich, and hopefully it's not too bad, or maybe not rich, but but you have to think about what you want to do and how you're going to get it in the place that you can. And the good news for all of you is that there is a much bigger and more easily traveled world than there was, a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations ago, and you should take advantage of that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carl. Anybody else would like to ask a question? Because we're almost about to say bye-bye to Carl. I know. It's been almost 45 minutes. I can't believe it.
Oh my gosh.
I know.
I talk too much.
Oh.
Teacher talking time.
I know, it's okay. So questions, guys? You're very shy today. Come on, guys. No questions? I know you have questions. Erika, I know you have a question. Hold on, I'll go to you, Grant, in a minute. I just need to make sure if one of the girls, I think some of the girls, but I cannot see very clearly. You have a question, Erika? No, just say no.
Well, yeah, I was just going to ask, like, you've been to London and to Colombia, right? And so where do you found that people were more like open to the thing you said about like changing the way you talk or whatever, like to being like open to be resilient towards you that were like foreigner? So I don't know if you understand me.
Well, I do think, I'm not a big fan of big cities. I mean, I live outside the Colombian capital. And I wasn't a huge fan of London. I lived in Little Cambridge, which was off to the side. But London is a very international city, kind of like New York in a way. And there are lots of people from all over the world. So I think to some extent that makes, if you wanted to be understood as a foreigner from somewhere else, well, London is an easy place to do that because everybody, well, not everybody, obviously, but lots of people are from somewhere else. So it's very easy to be a foreigner in London because there are already so many of you. And actually the danger in London, if any of you went to London, you'd probably find a billion other Mexicans, probably the guy from down the road. When I lived in Cambridge, like the people next door from me, there was a Colombian couple living on one side, and then on the other side, there was a Venezuelan Argentinian couple. So I got a lot of practice with Spanish for them originally. But, it's so easy in a place like Cambridge, which has a giant international university and lots of tech companies, or London, or New York, or somewhere like that. Certainly Bogota, the capital here in Colombia, it's more international now than it was 10, 20 years ago. You know, everything in Colombia was a little more Wild West 20 or 30 years ago. And there were fewer, you know, there were fewer foreigners coming just for business or whatever. And I'm part of a new wave of foreigners who've come here. So it's more international now. But still people are not, you know, as used to it. You know, equally at the same time, the important thing is to, you know, figure out your situation, your context. You can, you know, if you're in London, well, it's not just you being a foreigner, it's all the other people too. So you have to get used to the German people and the Spanish people and the Arabic people and the Indian people and the Chinese people. And, you know, it's, you know, because they're all getting used to it at the same time. In Bogota, I really only have to get used to Colombians. So that, you know, and the important thing again is to just figure out how to get inside. I have a lot of friends in Scandinavia, and certainly for Latin Americans, Scandinavians seem like they're very like distant and cold and formal, you know, and they're like that with each other too. You know, I remember having some friends, they, you know, their band had just released a record and people are saying, well, aren't you excited about your record? And they're like, we're finished. This is us being excited. But once you get inside, you know, once you know how people are and you get inside, then, you know, suddenly everybody is warm and friendly. It's just a different way of expressing it. So everybody thinks, oh, we're warm and open. You know, ask anyone. The Finns think they're warm and open. The Colombians think they're warm and open. You know, they think everybody else is weird and distant. But that's because everybody else is not weird and distant. It's because they're different. And what's the way that you show that you're being like friendly is not always the same. So
Yeah,
when that Finn is being really formal and polite to you, that's the first part of being friendly to you. And the Colombian and maybe the Mexican would think, oh, these people are distant and cold. But you know, you just have to learn, you know, learn how it is. You know, for us, you know, we've all seen on TV, you know, in Japan, you bow, but actually like the actual degrees that you bow in Japan mean different things. So you would have to learn that in order not to, you know, to understand what kind of bow it was. And that's just not part of our heads until you go and do your homework and you learn it. So your challenge in London would be avoiding other Mexicans. And trying to actually have an international experience. Avoid speaking Spanish.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you. That is great advice. Okay. Anybody else? Last question. So we can also leave our professor alone. I'm so sorry. And thank you so much because I know you just moved last week and it got very
I'm trying to
hectic.
avoid grading.
Oh, that's what I was going to say. I just finished like an hour ago. But if anybody else, I know. No questions, guys? No? Okay, no questions. Well, then I will only finish up by, my dear friend, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
No idea how much I appreciate you being our last guest because all these experiences, as I always tell my students, we can read about theory and we can read about business and global and international business, and the books will give us a lot of information. But these things that you have shared with us, this is not in any book. And sometimes it's even more important and more relevant to us than whatever we can learn in a book. So we really, truly appreciate it. I'll be in touch with you later, my dear friend. And thank you very much. Help me, guys, give him a big round of applause. There you go. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it, Carl. Thank you so much. And I will let you know when the video goes up into my YouTube channel, okay? So you can also share your participation with other students.
Will do. Well, thanks very much.